question. Is the sound all good?
Just a second.
Is the microphone on? Or I don't know. That's a good question. Are we using it or?
Not using it for the speaker.
Oh, we're not going to use it.
I can do the.
So you got to speak up.
Okay.
We're ready.
So welcome all. I'm Jenny Hawkins. I'm a volunteer and a board member for the Wallowa History Center, who is sponsoring today's event. We'll be hearing from David Weaver, our board president and historian, and also from Sarah Silbernagel, archaeologist, and also a member on Oregon's Commission on Historic Cemeteries. This event is hosted by the Wallowa History Center, and we're thankful that Fishtrap lent us their space for today. Some of you who have driven by our campus, the old ranger station in Wallowa, have seen that it's very busy there with restoration, and our own warehouse, which we like to use for events, right now is full of the siding that they're priming to do the repairs to the siding from the storm. So we're glad to be here for when we are doing that construction and updates. This is a great space to borrow. So if you're not familiar with the Wallowa History Center, it's an amazing organization that Marianne Burroughs and others helped start more than 2 decades ago in the basement of the Wallowa Library, and now it has grown so much and has housed the historic Bear Sleds Ranger Station in Wallowa. So I would like to take a moment before we begin and ask our board members and founders, such as Marianne, to stand up so if others have questions about the history center. So Marilyn, Marianne, Jack, Janet, Lisa, David, our president. Am I missing any of our board members that are here? If you have questions about the History Center, thank you. Feel free to ask one of our board members later. So, we also are proud to publish the Wallowa Quarterly Magazine. This comes out 4 times a year, and this is a benefit for those who are members. Our membership costs $20 a year, and if you're not yet a member, we have membership forms here so you can become a member today and take home your first issue of the quarterly. And many of you are familiar with the work of Mark Heiberger, and he is the powerhouse behind the Wallowa Quarterly. So with that, I think we're just about ready to get started. Today's lecture, presented by David and introduced by Sarah, is part of our spring series themed around historic cemeteries. So today we're inside with the lecture, but later in the season, Marilyn Hulse will be leading us on driving tours to pioneer cemeteries in the Lower Valley. So that will be May 7th, Sunday afternoon, and May 21st, Sunday afternoon. We'll be leaving from the History Center in Wallowa, and you can find more details on our website. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand things over to David and Sarah. Sarah Silbernagel drove in from Pendleton. She is an archaeologist and does a lot of work here regionally.
Yeah.
I'll hand things off to you.
Well, thank you all for having me. I'm going to try to talk loud enough that everybody can hear. If you can't hear me in the back, just let me know. But, okay. So, and then I have to remember how to use the mouse. Okay. So my presentation today, Curry Gill, who is in charge of the Historic Cemeteries Program, was going to try to give this presentation, but it was a long drive for her to get over from Salem with her work schedule didn't work. So I said I would volunteer and do this for her. I am one of the commissioners on our 7-member commission, and we meet quarterly and we discuss all the different topics that I'm going to show you here. Basically, I just wanted to give an overview of what the Historic Cemeteries Program does, what options are available to help people out, and where to go if you have questions or need support. Here's an example of a lot of different quotes that have been found on different tombstones throughout Oregon. So, Oregon Heritage is part of Oregon State Parks, and it has 4 different divisions. There's the Historic Cemeteries Program, the Oregon Heritage Commission, the Oregon Historic Trails Advisory Council, and the State Historic Preservation Office. So the Historic Cemeteries Program, it was started in the late 1990s as an act of the Oregon legislature and includes the creation of the Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries. And the commission is a body of 7 volunteers from around the state, and we bring various skills and experience to the commission with the overall goal of preservation of historic cemeteries. Some of the things the cemeteries program does is it maintains the historic cemeteries list. It runs the historic cemeteries grant program. It focuses on cemetery preservation, and it also provides technical support around the state in the form of information, workshops, and consultation. The historic cemeteries list requires that at least one burial of a person who died before 75 years before today's date. So at least one person in the cemetery has to have died that long ago. And they just recently changed this. It used to be a specific date prior to 1902, I believe, but now we're just moving it to, so anything 75 years since today. Any cemeteries that meet this definition and are not operating, meaning doing current burials, should be listed on the commission, and they can receive extra benefits and protections under the state law. Some cemeteries that are still doing burials can also be listed on there if they choose to. And this can include just individual burials. You know, if a landowner has just one person on their property that was buried before 75 years ago, then that would qualify as well. And under state law, property owners of or surrounding historic cemeteries must allow reasonable access to the cemeteries so that descendants can come visit. So the cemetery list is kind of the overarching goal of the Historic Cemeteries Program. And currently there are 1,500 listed historic cemeteries. I brought the Wallowa County list with me today, so if anybody has a question on whether or not a cemetery is on there or not, we can certainly take a look. It's also accessible online at the Historic Cemeteries website. So currently, we're working through the Historic Cemeteries grant applications, and this grant is annual, and it supports the preservation and interpretation of cemeteries listed with the commission. The grants can only be used for work on listed cemeteries, but anyone, even like a private individual, can apply for these and be eligible. Grants can fund historic feature preservation, tree trimming, fencing, records management, disaster mitigation, vandalism cleanup, interpretation, security systems, all sorts of things. Our biggest push right now is trying to focus on preservation of headstones and repair after vandalism or damage from weather. There's been a lot of weather issues you guys especially have had to deal with. And then trees and other landscape issues are another big one that, you know, we all thought maybe trees would be lovely in cemeteries, and now they're all falling on headstones and falling over, so. And the cemeteries grant, it's going to be, we're doing the review right now, and then the awardees will get listed in June. But I think it opens around January every year, and if you guys have any cemetery that you want help applying for a grant, you can contact me or Curry, and we're happy to help you guys with the working through that grant process. Workshops, we put on workshops a lot, and they focus on the preservation and maintenance, how to do headstone repair. We've done some of those, how to do marker cleaning, rules and regulations involving historic cemeteries, records and archiving, volunteers and organizing like cleanup days, researching to find out more about the genealogy of people buried in the cemetery, interpretation and living history. So these are often held in conjunction with our quarterly commission meetings, and our next one's going to be in Tillamook in July. Not that you guys probably want to travel that far, but if you're in July, or in Tillamook in July, you can also always attend them online. Since COVID, they've been doing, it's in conjunction with Zoom, so if you're ever interested, get in touch with us. And also the Oregon Heritage blog, I think, has a listserv you can put your email address on, and then they'll make sure you know when the meetings are coming up. So the commission also provides consultation and technical resources. It provides support for people caring for historic cemeteries, and online we have resources including heritage bulletins, which are focused on cleaning, hosting events, irrigation, water use, mowing, and then we also have position papers that are things like best practices, long-range planning workbook that you can use if you're in charge of the cemetery and you want to think about some long-range plans, a vandalism response workbook, and a lot of other things. And I put the web address right there for all of our technical bulletins. And if you need it later, just let me know and I can get you my email and send you all the links. So something new that we developed in 2020 is a cemetery care permit. This allows the commission to provide a permit for people who want to take care of an abandoned cemetery. If the cemetery isn't being cared for or doesn't have clear ownership and the property owner can't be contacted, but maybe they're the neighbor, or maybe they're somebody whose ancestors are in the cemetery and they really want to work on cleaning this up. So it allows them to do the work legally, covers all of that stuff. And then it also allows them to apply for grants, which would help with some of the preservation work. And that we haven't really had a big public discussion on that yet since it came out during 2020 and everything was shut down, but we're hoping to get more. Right now we have one permit for the whole state, but hopefully we'll get some more. So as you all know, these are common issues for historic cemeteries: the question of property ownership, preservation and vandalism, landscape issues, records and how to maintain them, interpretation and education, and outreach and engagement, and fundraising. So we're going to go into those a little bit further. So the question of property ownership, sometimes it's very clear, but many of Oregon's cemeteries were established at need when the Western immigrants who took donation land claims ended up donating a portion of their land for the community cemetery. The land was deeded to the community, which now has no legal meaning. So some cemeteries actually have no owner at all. Hence why we needed the cemetery care permit. Also, some cemeteries were created with a trust, but the trustees have passed away and descendants can't be found. This issue was, what we tried to remedy with that permit. And it doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened numerous times throughout the state. So preservation and vandalism, you can see an example of a wooden headstone in Sumter and then some issues of deterioration at the Applegate Cemetery near Ontario as well. Preservation is obviously a super challenging issue and the biggest one that we deal with. Time, weather, water, minerals in the water, natural disasters, and lots of other things can impact the preservation of historic cemeteries. The primary work of the commission and the priority of the grant is to do monument repair and historic feature preservation. So that's like our number one concern with everything else. But if you lose your headstones, you lose a lot of the history. And then vandalism is unfortunately a relatively common event. Often people who do the damage are caught. And under state law, if the cemetery is listed as historic and if they are charged correctly, the judge can apply restitution for repairs. So sometimes that's another advantage of having your cemetery on the list. So landscape features can be challenging sometimes as well. So we have some example of trees in Port Orford, example of, I'm not quite sure if it's English ivy or something that has gone a little crazy in the Cottage Grove one. Here's an example of Baker City. That cemetery is actually mostly all native plants and everything there, so that one's a little easier to maintain than some others. And then an example of the Sumter Cemetery. So things to consider with landscape are, the topography of the cemetery, irrigation, whether you have irrigation or don't have irrigation, trees and whether they're impacting headstones or not, aesthetic preferences. They're all issues that the cemeteries have to address, and hard to find middle ground sometimes on those where people want to be. We just created a new bulletin on invasive species in cemeteries and how to deal with those, since noxious weeds are kind of on everyone's radar right now and they're difficult to maintain in cemeteries. Oftentimes we don't have a lot of staff and people to help, so we created a bulletin to try to show them where there's other grants and funding and resources throughout the state to adequately address weed issues in historic cemeteries. Records maintenance, they are a critical resource, and We're definitely big proponents that records should be preserved and copies held by another trusted organization like a local museum or library. It's currently our big topic that we're going to discuss at our July meeting. It's hard to transition, getting some sort of digital platform is expensive and it's time consuming and it's hard for people to do this. So we're trying to figure out, how do we help cemeteries come up with ways to do this and maintain and keep their records for future generations. So interpretation and engagement. It's a great way to preserve cemeteries is to garner community support like Wallowa History Center has been doing, so good job. Inviting the community to become stewards of these important resources is super important. These are records of the community as a whole, and cemeteries can offer cleanup days, genealogical research days, memorial events like Memorial Day and Veterans Day. And the value of the cemetery can be promoted through education about the people buried there through both tours, like your driving tour that you're doing, brochures, websites, living history events, and by sharing information about the monument designs. So, Jenny already put a plug in, but I was going to put a plug in May 7th and 21st. You guys should definitely go on the driving tours. Those will be awesome and a great opportunity. So, just a little brief stuff on monument design that you can think about while you're on the cemetery tour is a lot of times there's different symbols on the markers for fraternal organizations, as well as some traditional art and symbols that are on cemetery markers. The lamb often is most commonly used on children's burials. When the lamb has a crown, it's a religious reference to Jesus. And the willow tree, this is an old symbol and less common, but I have seen it on some markers, so that's interesting. Gates of Heaven is very common. And then some more that are common are a lily, the wheat, the sheaf of wheat, and the winged hourglass indicate passage of time, and the column that's broken on the lower right indicates end of a very long life. And then on the lower left, the two hands clasping, if there's a very decorative cuff and a simple cuff, that represents marriage. And if it's just a simple cuff and a simple cuff, it represents the hand of God welcoming the person. So some interesting. And then there's some more fraternal organization markers, as well as the one on the right, which I'm very curious if any of you have seen this in Wallowa County. It's a Woodmen of the World cemetery marker. So it was essentially started as a life insurance organization for people with dangerous jobs, such as logging. And it has log, axe head, hammer, sometimes a beetle or a bee. And part of the payout, as being part of that, was to have a monument that is in the shape of a stump. So here's a few more Woodmen of the World examples. But has anybody seen those? I'm just curious. I have not.
I think there's some up in the Enterprise Center.
Okay, cool. And then death practices. So you'll see different death practices as you go through these cemeteries. They're related to religion, cultural, and family tradition, and you can see a lot of that in the cemeteries, and it just provides some more of that history that can be interpreted when you guys are out there doing tours and looking around. And then last but not least, we have the Oregon Heritage Exchange blog, which currently all the commissioners are supposed to be submitting stories. So we're supposed to go out to cemeteries and try to come up with a story either about the cemetery or about someone who's buried in that cemetery, and volunteer projects, cleanup stories, any of that kind of thing. So if anyone has a really amazing or interesting story that they want to share, we would be happy to publish it on there. We're trying really hard to utilize this blog as a way to get public awareness about historic cemeteries and how important they are to preserve and protect and engage the community as a whole at the state level. So, whoops, that was not what I wanted to do. Okay, so contacts. The Historic Cemeteries Program coordinator is Curry Gill, who couldn't be with us today, but she is amazing and she is always willing to help with phone call or email or anything. If you have questions at all, Curry is the person to go to, and she's super wonderful. And then I am the Northeast Oregon representative on the Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries. So I am also available to help and answer questions and forward you guys on to Curry when I need to. So, yeah, and then our website's at the very bottom, but that is it for my presentation. Are there any questions or do we have time, or do you want to do those at the end? What do you guys?
I just have one quick note for the History Center. Sarah had mentioned digitizing. I can see that. Digitizing. We're digitizing our whole collection.
Oh.
So that may be something
Yeah.
that's going to open us up.
Yeah.
We can partner with the state to do as far
That'd be
as
awesome.
local.
Yeah.
We have some very well-knowledge people that sit on our board, way more than I am.
And I would encourage people to also like apply to the grant next year for that if you need funding to help with it. You know, say we're covering X amount of cemeteries and we're going to digitize the records and they're going to be held at, you know, this place where it's accessible, or sometimes there's privacy issues and they don't want it publicly accessible necessarily, but maybe like researchers, if they get approved, can access it, that kind of thing. So definitely something to think about.
Yes, we can help with the grant writing. Sadie or I can. So.
Any other questions, if that's okay to ask? Okay. Thank you guys so much. And if anybody needs to see the list, I have it up here.
Right, thanks, Sarah. It'll take me 1 second to swap out presentations, but Marilyn, would you, not to put you on the spot, but would you mind saying a little more detail about the tours on those 2 days? Where are you going?
Well, first of all, I have Jenny Hawkins to thank. She's done all the admin work on getting the cemeteries tours together. Makes it much easier on me. All I have to do is plan what I'm going to say and what I'm going to talk about. Jenny has the rest under control. Are we going May 7th? Which one are we doing? Bramlett and...
May 7th is Bramlett and Lost Prairie.
Okay, not Lost Prairie, the Lost Cemetery.
The Lost Cemetery.
Okay. It's on, we're doing two on the first run. The first one is the Bramlett Cemetery, which is an historic cemetery in the very, very lower valley of Wallowa. It's right after you break through the canyons and come into the valley. It has an interesting person buried there, an old desperado that was mentally ill, frankly, and there was no one to care for mentally ill people in the late 1800s. And so it came to a bad end. He had to be dispatched. Very, very sad thing in today's world, but in those days, there was no one to care for mentally ill people. So he was one of the first buried there, and his story would be worthy of one of these cemetery stories. It's not that it hasn't been written. The late Grace Bartlett did a beautiful job of capturing the story of this man and what the settlers in the very lower valley had to do. So it's already been captured in stories. There's some other interesting features in the Bramlett Cemetery. And one interesting thing, that it was a Methodist church cemetery in its beginning, and they took care of it, and not until the 1950s was it put on the tax rolls of Wallowa. Then the other one we'll be visiting is over on a ranch that has many, many names. Every generation calls it something different. The generation of people that are now dead and gone called it the McDonald Place. My parents' generation called it Severe's. My generation called it Hadley's. And then there's been a couple more names now. So it is a lost cemetery. The Department of Transportation in their cemetery surveys many decades ago just put it down as an abandoned lost cemetery. What happened is someone moved in and in the years of the Severes rented that ranch, and they removed all the tombstones to make a foundation for the barn. Several years ago, Timothy Hadley, who grew up on that ranch, came back and showed me the exact spot they are as a foundation for the barn. And that's another interesting cemetery story. It's impossible. I think you'd have to tear the barn down to ever retrieve them. So they're impossibly lost. We are very lucky that we have a list of the people buried there. There's about 10. And one of them is a very historical family at Wallowa, the Chamberlain family. The Chamberlain ditch runs across the upper Diamond area, named for the same family, and there are some Chamberlains. There's also the famous story of Chief Joseph rescuing a Reverend Weber in the river near there, and he is buried there as well. And that's the reason the mountain behind that ranch became known as Weber Mountain. So there's some nice little things in each one, and then later on the 21st, we'll visit Lost Teen Cemetery and one on the Allen Canyon Loop Road near Lost Teen, where all of the Finley children who died in the diphtheria epidemic, they pulled their wagon up alongside the stockade near the Scott Ranch in Middle Valley, and the children died one by one, and they were all taken up there and buried. And then the later Finleys went on down to Imnaha, and their relatives down there included, Marianne, help me, the one who married Jack Johnson, Al Duckett. Al Duckett. Florence Finley, right. She was one of the children who survived, and then later they moved to Cedar Mill, Oregon, and they had another child down there, and there's considerable things in Cedar Mill today, a school named the Finley School. So it'll be interesting. Come if you can.
Thank you, Marilyn. And see if I can find my mouse here. I got it. Okay, yeah, and speaking of the West Side Cemetery outside of Lost Teen, one of the folks we'll be talking about today is also buried there in an unmarked grave. So this talk is on Old Joseph's grave, and it's a long history. It continues today, carrying forward, but today on this talk we're going to focus in really narrowly on a specific claim, and that is whether Gerard Cochran and Michael Pfefferly robbed the grave of Old Joseph in 1879 or 1880. So out of that long history, long, involved, interesting, and important history, I think, we'll be focused kind of on that narrow topic. And Old Joseph's Nez Perce name, Tiwi Takis Rich, you're better at the pronunciation. Am I in the neighborhood? Hopefully. Yeah. So that's what we'll be talking about. And specifically, this is the claim, and it is this. Sam Wade said he'd often seen a good horse lying beside the grave, but not skinned, and the Indians told him it was for the chief to have a fresh horse in the happy hunting grounds. Wade also said that Gerard Cochran told him he and El Pfefferelli robbed the grave in about 1879 or 1880, one very bright moonlit night, and did it in a hurry, and said not to tell anyone, for if the Indians found out, they would kill him sure. McAlexander said he didn't know anything about the grave being robbed, though it could have been, and he would not have known it. So that's a statement, and a few of the questions we're going to try to get to the bottom of here are these. First of all, where does this statement even come from? What's the source of it? Who are these people that are mentioned in it? And can we in any way verify that statement? And if we can, why did these guys rob the grave? Those are the basic questions we'll try to answer as we go. But before we start heading down that road, well, we will be heading down that road. In terms of the people mentioned, of course, it mentions a chief. The chief, of course, is Old Joseph, Joseph the Elder. We would need way more time than we have to talk about Joseph's, the Elder's life than we have time for today. I will, in the future, talk about his life more fully, but I would just say that, you know, he was just a towering figure in Pacific Northwest history, just a very amazing person. And it's odd that his biography has never been written. Josephi and others have covered pretty decent swaths of his life, but as far as anyone sitting down and writing his full history, it's not there. So it's a little surprising. But what I've tried to do is read all I could, particularly from the original sources about what he said. And it's a little dicey because, of course, he's speaking Nez Perce, and then that's being translated into English. And most of where he's directly quoted is in a council, in a treaty council, or something of that nature, where the interpreter is interpreting what he said, right? So it gets a little tricky on understanding the exact meaning that he's talking about. But one of the things that comes up around Tiwakakas time after time when he is quoted is this notion of what he's up to. Everything he's up to is about keeping the land, not for himself, but for his children and the next generations to follow. So we can see this just time and time again. And he says in this quote, which is an early one from the 1855 Treaty Council at Wallowa, and he says, first of all, prior to the council and the notes of the council, at Governor Stevens' request, lawyer Timothy and Joseph will make a map of their country. So that was one of the things they set out to do, was map out where their lands were, because they were ceding vast amounts of land to the incoming settlers with General Stevens. But old Joseph said, in this council, these are my children. I see them all sitting there. Talking slowly is good. It's good for old men to talk straight on both sides and take care of one another. It's not us, it is those of our children who come after us. It's good for the old people to talk together, good and straight, on account of our children on both sides, to take care of each other till the last day. Without speaking, I am going. It's not anything bad that I'm thinking that I'm going without speaking. No, it's not anything bad. It's a place to live, a place for our good to live there. Think for year after year for a far way ahead. I can get my clicker right. So, 1855, there's Joseph speaking, and then this is the current monument, and I'm sure most of you are all familiar with it, up at Wallowa Lake. So, the story, this larger story of his death and burial, and then ultimately resting up at Wallowa Lake, is part of this large history. And I would just say, right off the bat, that when we think about the original monument to Joseph, it was just outside of Wallowa, where the confluence of the rivers come together, the Wallowa and the Lost Teen, up on a little knoll there. And what it looked like, and we know this from a couple of historical sources, was that it was a pole pen, log cabin style, and at one end of it was a 12-foot pole, 10 or 12-foot pole, squared off on two sides and painted red, and attached to the top of it was an arm which hung a school bell. And typically every year, as the Nez Perce were coming into the lower valley, which they did annually, they would sacrifice a horse at that grave, and the horse would either be laying beside the grave, and at least in a couple instances, the hide would be stretched across the grave there. So that's what the original monument to Joseph that was built by the Nez Perce looked like, and this is where we're at today. And as we think about this history of monuments, and there's the original source from the Horner papers about what it looked like, and kind of fairly as I described it. Horner, from a few of his sources, says at the time the Indians buried old Chief Joseph permanently, they built a pole pen around the grave and placed heavy poles on top of the pen. They then set a pole 10 or 12 feet high in the ground at the head of the grave, which was hewed on two sides, leaving it about 5 inches through, and painted it red, and fastened a piece of wood to the top of the pole for an arm, which they fastened a small school bell to, so it would hang clear of the pole and jingle when the wind blew. When the grave was exhumed in August of 1926, All the local papers carried accounts of that, and the Enterprise Record Chieftain was edited by one of the men who participated in that exhumation, and what he wrote at the time was, little is known of the life of the first Joseph, except that he was the father of the famous warrior of the same name, and that he died and was buried in the Middle Valley. So there wasn't a whole lot known about old Joseph at the time. Of course, his son, young Joseph, who died in 1904, when he died, he was internationally famous. An example of that, there's a French magazine from October 5th. That shouldn't say 1940. That should say 1904. Sorry, typo. And then a picture of Joseph on the left. So he was known across the world on his death. Just another quick example of Joseph with William Cody, Buffalo Bill, at New York City Wild West show in 1897. Cody tried to get Joseph, young Joseph, to join. He declined. But so we have this young Joseph, very famous on his death, internationally known, and Joseph the Elder, not so well known at his death. And speaking to this a bit, when just after old Joseph had died and young Joseph had taken over the leadership of the Wallowa Nez Perce, they had a council because settlers were coming into the valley at that time. Monteith, the Nez Perce agent, who had just been newly appointed and came out of Albany as in that position, met with Joseph at the confluence of the Wallowa and the Lost Teen. And when Monteith reported it, he said, I asked Joseph what he had to say, and he commenced by saying that his father never traded off that country, and on his dying bed about a year ago, bequeathed the whole valley to him for his band. He said that his father planted a stick on the mountains between the Grand Ram Valley and Wallowa, that now that stick had grown to a large tree, and the whites derived subsistence from one side and the red people the other. That now the whites were trying to get on their side and drive them away from their food. That his father bequeathed to him that country for subsistence of himself and band, and wanted all the whites to leave the valley. Joseph said his father signing the treaty, as for his father signing the treaty, it was a lie. His father never traded off the country and never received anything for it, did not want to sell it, that his father had been taught to read, but when he found out the whites were trying to get the Wallowa Valley, he tore up the treaty and his testament, he's talking about the New Testament, and joined his people. All he wanted was for me to order the whites out of the valley. So there's a couple things we're thinking about here, I think. And first is conceptions of property ownership between the Nez Perce and Plateau folks and the settlers. On one hand, with the Nez Perce, you have notions of communal land ownership, group ownership. No one specifically, no one person owned the Wallowa Valley in their system. That's over and opposed to our system, which is really founded and based in private property, a single person owning a piece of ground. So these two are really diametrically opposed to each other. Joseph here is carrying forward his father's insistence that they retain the land, and also playing into a little bit of his understanding about how white folks understood land ownership. Joseph here in this kind of strange quote where he says, Father planted a stick on the mountain between the Grand Ram Valley and Wallowa. Those were actually monuments that Joseph himself set up marking the Wallowa Valley. So the main route from the Grand Ram Valley into the Wallowa was basically down Minam Summit, and Joseph planted these markers which mimicked the surveyor monuments that when the surveyors came in and started surveying the land to mark his territory. So that's what that's referring to. Yes?
Just talk about Monteith a little bit, because I am confused. We had just gotten the United States had just gotten that from the British, right? The Oregon area.
Well, this actually, by the time 1870, when Monteith was made the agent, he was part of a wealthy wheat family the Monteiths owned in Albany. They owned wheat mills. His connection was that they were very strong Presbyterians in that area. And so at that time with the peace policy and changing of kind of how they were dealing with the reservation system with President Grant, they were pursuing this idea that they would turn over the reservations to various denominations, Presbyterian, Catholic, Quaker. And so Monteith was a part of that. That was his connection. They were also wealthy in the Willamette Valley, the Monteith family, and he was a staunch Republican. Grant was a Republican, so he slid in through those connections because they were all politically appointed. So if there was a change in politics and there was a Democratic president, the Republican former folks who were appointed by the Republican president would all be changed. So it was a pretty constant turnover of Indian agents on reservations. I don't know if that, Millie, if that... Oh boy, let me think. Yeah, I think it was Rich. I think it was A.J. Kane. I'll check on that, but I think it was Kane. But no, that's not right. We'll dive into this. But there was a brief period of 2 military officers who was there in the transition because first they turned over to the military, and then they changed their mind and turned it over to the religious organizations. So there was 2 military officers who were there for a brief time. Escaping my memory, though. So just a quick little overview of this longer history of this grave, of old Joseph's grave at the confluence. And so we know pretty closely, there's been a lot of debate over exactly when he died, in what month. I think the best sources showed us that he died about August, middle of August, 1871. Those are pretty good sources. So while the Nez Perce were up here fishing, hunting, grazing, spending their time in the summer in the Wallowa Valley, he died just at the confluence. In 74 or 75, that original bell was stolen from the grave. It's claimed by a minister's son in Cove. There's pretty good evidence to support that. And then in 78, reported by the person who settled the land that some whites, after the Bannock War of 1878, threatened to destroy Joseph's grave. And then the first grave robbery, which we'll be focusing in and discussing in more in detail, 79 or 80. The second grave robbery happened in 1886. That one we can certainly verify from several other historical sources that it absolutely happened. And then the skull of Tuikakis was displayed in Baker City in 1897. And in 1900, young Joseph came back in his last visit to Wallowa County, or the Wallowa country, trying to regain land here, visited his father's grave in 1900. And then in 1901, there's, depending on who you're looking at in the sources, either a dozen or 8 or 9 additional graves there, and those were looted in 1901. The pole fence that originally surrounded the grave was piled and put off to the side. The area wasn't plowed, but that pole fence was piled and put off to the side. And then in 1917, what was left of the pole fence and the native grasses and bushes, currant bushes and elderberry bushes that were there were burned, and the area was plowed. And then John Horner began his investigation of the grave and where it was located and the history of it in 1918. And then Peopeo Talikt, who was an amazing character, he began on the Nez Perce side. He participated in the 1877 war with Joseph, young Joseph. He began efforts to move young Joseph's body back to the Wallowa and help protect those cemeteries. And then in 1921, Nez Perce and Umatilla folks and some Cayuse folks came in to identify the burial spots in Wallowa County. They identified 5, including one that we're talking about there at the confluence. And then in 1923, the ditch companies up at the lake deeded that parcel where the current monument is for the use of the reburial of Joseph. And then in 1926, he was exhumed and moved up there. So that's just a general overline or outline of the big history of the grave site. And so in terms of the source, where does this statement come from? Where do we get it? It comes from John Harlan Horner, and many of you probably have delved into the Horner papers. And so the statement comes from the Horner papers, which is 1,580 odd pages of a typewritten manuscript that Horner put together. And a little bit about the history of all that and Horner himself. Horner came with his family across the plains and landed in Boise City. And from there, they were there 3 or 4 years. And then they came to Wallowa County in 1884, and they went down to Imnaha and on Camp Creek and Trail Creek at the junction. And his father and mother homesteaded there. And then Horner, as a young man, homesteaded on one of the forks of the creeks up there. And he went to school in Imnaha early on. And probably around, he started investigating Wallowa County history in about 1916 or 1917, based on the formation of the Wallowa County Pioneer Association. And they formed a committee, historical committee, to start really investigating Wallowa County history. Prior to that time, and what you see in these photographs is that committee began putting these scrapbooks together. You're looking at the Indian scrapbook that they put together. That's in the Wallowa County Museum currently. There's some 8 or 12 scrapbooks that the historical committee of the Wallowa County Pioneers put together, started building in around 1916. And the other on the far left is part of the front page of Horner's document. The funny thing about that, Horner papers, is John Horner was definitely an intelligent man. He just had limited education. So as far as reading it, it's a little tricky. Lots of typos, grammar's out the window. He writes it just as he speaks. And then early on, the organizing convention that he was trying to use was place names. That went out the window. And so what you get is just kind of random bits interspersed here and there through the pages, and it just goes from one thing to the next. So it can be really difficult to read. And if you're researching a particular topic, I'm looking at Mary Ann, who is really familiar, and I know Marilyn, you got to dig a little bit. You got to dig. It's helpful that Oregon State Historical Society has recently digitized it so you can word search it now, which makes a big difference. But it's an amazing piece of work. Horner was not a historian in the traditional sense. In other words, he wasn't gathering a bunch of sources and a bunch of information and then interpreting it and coming up with a synthesis about this is the way it was and this is the way it was. No, he was just recording stories. So he wandered around with a notebook, and he would talk to lots of pioneers and lots of early settlers here, and he would record their stories. And so this document is really important to our history because a lot of what we know about Wallowa County history comes here. So, super important. And as I said, this is, there's an early shot of the Wallowa County Pioneer Association. They met annually, usually up at Wallowa Lake, but they changed location. This is one from 1917 of them meeting up at the lake. And in terms of them talking about and investigating old Joseph's grave, they started focusing in on talking about where they thought it was and when he died and that sort of thing, because there was some debate whether it was up at Wallowa Lake, which some claimed, or whether it was down at the confluence of the Wallowa and the Lost Teen. They did, in this particular meeting, they settled that debate, at least in their own minds, that it was located at the confluence of the Wallowa and Lost Teen. And there's just too much good evidence to say otherwise. And this is a shot taken by John Horner in 1918. In the photograph there you have on the left, that's W.W. White, Wesley White, who was one of the earliest settlers in Wallowa County. And then the middle, that's Americus McAlexander, who owned the property or settled on the property where the grave was located. And on the far right, James Tully, who was also another very early pioneer. And it's Horner taking the photograph. And they're standing there in August 1918 at the gravesite. You can see all vestige of it is, at that point, it's gone. There's not even a rock cairn marking it at that point. And so Horner, jumping ahead a little bit, when they exhumed the grave in August 27th, 1926, Horner had this to say about it. When we got to the grave, I told the boys there were 8 graves in this burying ground. And they said, then how do you know this is the right one? And I said, well, dig here, and if the head is gone, it's the right one. McAlexander came while we were digging and said, yes, this is the right one. And after opening the grave and digging everything out, we had all the skeleton but the head. 2 vertebrae and part of the foot, which the badgers had dug out. We also found part of one moccasin, which had been cut with a very sharp knife, and a great many beads, some of which had been scattered on the surface by the badgers digging. 1 small clam or oyster shell with holes drilled in it, and 1 white button, and part of what appeared to be a butcher knife, which was all rusted away except part of the handle. So when they exhumed the grave, that is what they found. And I apologize, a little bit washed out. That is a photograph of the day they were exhuming the grave. And in it, oh boy, I don't know how well you can see it. It's pretty dim on mine. But the young man to the left, that's Harold Dubois. He was just a high school kid visiting his uncle. His uncle is in the center there. That's Henry Dubois, who was the principal at Joseph High School. Harold had come up to spend the summer with his uncle from Indiana. And then just to the young man's right, who's kneeling there, that's David B. Revis, one of the pioneer grandchildren of his namesake, David B. Revis Sr., who settled in 1877 up on Alder Slope. And then Ben Weathers off to the right, the editor of the Enterprise Record Chieftain at the time, and Horner's taking the photograph.
What prompted them to dig them up?
Oh boy, Millie, that is,
Because it's always been a mystery to me that they should ever touch them.
yeah. I fully intended when talking with Jenny to do a full history of this. There's just too much there in one presentation shot, so we had it in our mind that a full history of it would take about 3-hour presentations to even get close to some of those questions.
Is it important?
Yeah, I obliquely it is in there, the why of it, yeah.
So sometimes you just think we just want to grave on them.
Yeah, no, I think there, I'll say offhand that the push to move it coincided with the burgeoning tourist industry in Wallowa County. That was a big part of it. A grave out in the middle of the field with no mark or anything wasn't very, didn't draw the tourists in. It wasn't so much that they were concerned with old Joseph's grave. They were working to get young Joseph's grave moved from Nespelem to Wallowa Lake. That's where the big push was, because if they could get young Joseph here, that's an internationally known, famous, famous Native American that would be at Wallowa Lake. So, but this is a whole rabbit trail of information. Huh?
This is the fall lecture series.
Yeah.
Were there actually people from Wallowa County going to Nespelem to ask them to bring it back? There are Indians.
There was a whole group of people in the county writing letters along with petitions to get the grave moved. But the Nez Perce folks were divided on this issue.
I know, because everybody said they came to this
Yeah, so there was not agreement about whether that was a good idea or a bad idea amongst the folks. Pardon? Yeah. Well, yes, and visits. There were some meetings and visits. So, so the first thing here, and I know we got some folks that are tied into the Wade family here today. The statement in Horner comes from Sam Wade. And so it's good if we're evaluating that statement, what we think about it, to know a little bit about Sam Wade. That's Sam Wade's homestead, and if you can see on the map, and again, apologize for the light, but basically at Wade Point, if you're going from Lost Teen to Enterprise, before you hit the passing, you go around the river corners there before you hit the passing lanes, and you go across the bridge at the mouth of Wade Gulch, that is still in the Wade family. That's where Sam Wade homesteaded. That was the main route, of course, from the lower valley, middle valley, from Lost Teen up to Enterprise, was up that gulch. That was how the road went. And so Sam was right on the main highway there. And Sam had come out to the Grand Round Valley some 1873, probably got that date wrong, but right there, right around that time. And he was almost certainly in the Wallowa Valley prior to actually filing a homestead claim, where he did. When I look at the homestead records, it showed that he proved up, I think his 5-year prove-up period would say that he initiated that in about 1877. But like I said, he was surely in the valley prior to that time. He was a cattleman, a wheat rancher. He became really well known for his Percheron stallions, or horses, workhorses, and won a number of awards for that. He was also one of the major stockholders for the Enterprise Bank. So he's, well-respected, solid citizen in the county, and an early settler. And he was the source for Horner. He's the one who said, this is where I heard that. And then the other person mentioned in there is this impossibly named Americus Vespucci McAlexander, who was the person that homesteaded and claimed the land where old Joseph's grave was located. And there's only 2 known photographs of Americus, AV as they called him. This is one from, again, another Pioneer Association meeting. And that you can see he was a very tall fellow. But the McAlexanders came to the Wallowa Valley in AV came and made his claim in 1876 at the Forks, and his claim is 160 acres, included the grave site. The McAlexander family were really well connected. His father built the penitentiary, the state penitentiary. He was a brick mason. He also built the first University of Oregon buildings, and he was Andrew McAlexander, AV's father, was involved in politics, and they're a fairly well-to-do family in the Willamette Valley, centered around Eugene. AV, their push to move up here, I think, was based on the notion that AV wanted to pursue cattle raising and farming, so the family moved into Union County, into Union, and then made their way over here to Wallowa County. And there's, you can see where the arrows are pointing there. That's the Highway 82 there, and then the 2 chunks of AV's property, kind of located near the bridge on the Lost Teen River there. And his father homesteaded connected piece in section 30 on the north side there, connected with AV's piece as well. And so, and speaking about AV, America's McAlexander, one of the interesting events that occurred is, again, when young Joseph came back in 1900 for the final time, trying to establish a reservation in Wallowa County. The photograph in the upper right was taken by Frank Revis, just here in the upstairs of the old bank building that did function as the courthouse. Revis had a little studio up there. And so you have James McLaughlin, the Indian inspector who had come with young Joseph to make the decision whether it was feasible or not. And then the interpreter down seated there on the left, and Peo Talit, who I mentioned previously, and a young man that was along with them as kind of camp help, and also was an orphan from the 1870s war. In any case, James McLaughlin wrote a book called My Friend the Indian, and I think it was published, I'm going to get this wrong, I think about 1911, after this visit. And what he said, what he mentions is that he and Joseph went with me down into the country where the grave of his father was made. We found the grave of old Joseph, his father, a white man who owned the ground in which the old man's bones were interred, with a spirit too rare among his kind, had the plat enclosed and kept the grave in such condition that the heart of Joseph, who was with me, was melted, and he wept. So it's worth thinking about just for a minute that Joseph's not only coming back trying to establish regain land in the Wallowa. On that journey, he goes back down to his father's grave on the McAlexander farm with McLaughlin. A.V. McAlexander is there. At that point, the pole fence is still there. It hasn't been plowed. But this is happening in 1900. In 1900, A.V. McAlexander, knew that the grave had been robbed for a second time, and A.V. McAlexander knew that the skull was not there. And the reason he knew that, because he was present when it happened. And so McLaughlin indicates that A.V. had enclosed the thing himself, which was not true. The Nez Perce had enclosed the grave. A.V. had just declined to tear it down and plow it up. I don't mean to impugn America's McAlexander. I don't think he was a bad person or anything like that. But part of the reason why they would not have monkeyed with the grave, especially early on, is because there were still, even after post-1877, there were lots of native folk coming into Wallowa Valley. Cayuse, Umatilla, Palouse, Nez Perce, coming here annually to graze, hunt, fish. If something had happened to that grave, it would not have been good for the person who was keeping an eye on it. The other thing is that when the native groups, the Nez Perce and Umatilla, came back to try to buy the land, McAlexander was willing to sell it, at about double the price. So he wasn't going to give it away. But in any case, that was 1900.
When did the natives stop coming here to hunt and fish?
Oh my gosh, that's a whole other rabbit hole. But yeah, rabbit trail. There was a long series of petitions by the local folks to stop that, because the folks coming off the Umatilla, folks coming off the Lapaway Reservation would come in every year to hunt, graze, fish, pick berries, gather camas and all that. So really, I would say it was pretty well curtailed by about 1930. But they really shut it off about 1900 in a big way. Yeah. And my great-grandfather, as well as my great-grandfather, signed several of those petitions. You can look up the petition. I think we might have one on our website, maybe.
We have one at the center.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing some writing at the Wallowa History Center about the 1901 petition carried by John Henry Wilson of Wallowa, an Indian agitator.
Yeah. So, some of those, I've got copies of a couple different versions of these petitions, but they basically started very early on to try to stop. And the treaty rights, that they signed in 1855 gave those native groups the right to hunt, fish, and graze in all their accustomed places. In other words, if it wasn't privately owned and it was Forest Service land or public land, that was part of the treaty obligation. But it was not only that the settlers, as more and more land was settled, many of the settlers, of course, used the public land as free grazing. Because prior to 1899, 1900, you could just go graze on it. And so there was lots of conflict over those grazing between sheepmen, cattlemen, horsemen. And then there was conflict between the Nez Perce and the Umatilla and Wallowa Cayuse trying to come back and graze as well. So you had this really, contentious situation. The first thing they did is said, well, we know we need to get rid of the native folks coming and using the grazing. So, yeah.
Where did they send the petitions to?
They sent them various places. They sent them to the Secretary of the Interior. They sent them to the chief of the Indian Bureau. They sent them to the Indian agents of both Lapaway and Umatilla. So, and they sent them to their local representatives up the chain that way. So they spread them around pretty widely. Yeah. And so that's basically A.V. McAlexander's story. But before I leave that, just one thing to think about is he showed up in 1876 at a really tense time, and we'll talk more when we talk about Gerald Cochran about that time. But in that very tense time in 1876, when the Nez Perce Josephine was still here, still claiming the property, he shows up and he homesteads on that ground with this very important grave site of a very respected leader, right? So that just kind of added insult to injury in that once that became private property, they in theory didn't have access to that gravesite. Although I have no doubt that McAlexander did not stop them from access. It was clear that he didn't stop them from going to the grave. So the other person mentioned in this is Gerard Cochran. He was born in 1854 and died in 1887. The Cochrans originally came to the Willamette Valley, and they also were centered around Eugene initially, and in Lane County. And then by the 1860s, Gerard's father, James, they'd settled over in the Klickitat country in the gorge right around Stevens, Washington, if you know where that is. And his father was a mechanic. In other words, he was a skilled carpenter and a blacksmith in terms of building mills, sawmills, and flour mills, and that sort of thing. So they had pushed on into the Grand Round Valley pretty early, and by 1870, they're living in the Grand Round Valley. Gerard's older brother, William, when Gerard was about 12, was shot and killed by his brother-in-law in a poker game playing for whiskey in the Cove, in Cove, in about 1870, excuse me. This is the first notice we have of Gerard from the Mountain Sentinel in 1872. It's just a little county court notice. Convicted of larceny, they've misspelled his name. Gerald Cochran was charged with the larceny of a pair of boots from the premises of Union kept by William Washburn. He was tried before Justice Fitzwater, found guilty and sentenced to pay a fine of $50, cost amounting to $15, for which sum Cyrus Prescott became security, and the prisoner was released. So about 17 years old, Gerard gets into his first little bit of trouble there by stealing a pair of boots. It's interesting that Washburn was one of two shoemakers in the area, cobblers in the area. Washburn had a reputation for wandering around with a notebook and recording native words, developing a dictionary of native words. The editor of the Sentinel didn't think that was too cool and wrote a scathing little bit about not to go to Washburn as a cobbler, to go to the other guy who's not doing such a ridiculous thing. Washburn himself ended up in a Ford farm outside of Rock Lake in Washington years later. I don't know what that all means, but... But that's the first notice we get of Girard. Interestingly, T.T. Gear, who became the governor of Oregon, in his book 50 Years in Oregon, he recounted a trip that there was about 10 or 12 of them who came up to the lake in August of 1875, and they were basically going from Cove, because Gear himself lived in Cove with his wife at the time. He had an orchard there, and it was years later that he became governor. But on this trip, Girard was along, and they loaded up their wagons. They put an old rowboat in there, and away they went to the lake in 1875. It's interesting that in this account, which is really well written and kind of an entertaining account, basically of a camping trip to Wallowa Lake, the picture you get is there were so many fish, redfish at Wallowa Lake, that it was insane. And so they threw their leaky rowboat, as it mentions here, in, and away they went up to the head of the lake. They bailed out and just started clubbing fish. And then they got these mountains of fish, which they got some local folks, sugar barrels from some local settlers, filled them up, and started on their way back to the Grand Round. They didn't make it because on a bump, the barrels came out of the back of the wagon, shattered, and put the fish all over the thing. But what's interesting is when they came in at that precise time, the precise time they were going up the valley was a very tense time. The military was down in the lower valley around Wallowa. There was some, by their accounts, 3,000 Nez Perce horses in Lower Valley, some 80 Nez Perce lodges. Joseph is meeting with the, I think it was Whipple, if I get the year right, the commander of the Wallowa military in the valley. So it was a very tense time. And T.T. Gear writes this account, never once mentions any of that. And then a little bit later, in that same year, after he got back from the fishing trip, we have this case from Union County, case number 701, and there's this statement. I, Joseph Turnbow, being duly sworn, say that on the 5th day of November 1875 in the county of Union, say that E. Cochran, James Cochran, Girard Cochran, Alex Cochran, and Eli Ostrander committed a riot by then and there combining and acting together and without authority of the law, with force and violence, did there and then tear down and demolish my dwelling house then and there in Union County. And being armed, did threaten to shoot me, and then and there, with force and arms being combined and acting together without authority of law and by threats of violence, prevented me going to my said residence or remaining at my home with force and violence, and with threats of violence drove me away from the same. Joseph Turnbow. So that's his statement. And what had happened in this case is that, again, the Cochrans had a mill in the Cove, and I'm guessing that what has happened is the Turnbows, who were elderly folks, Joseph and Mary Turnbow, had bought some lumber and built a house, and the Cochrans came over, I'm guessing over non-payment, and tore the house down. All of the men they were indicted, but they all got away scot-free, and never suffered. There was no consequences for what they had done because the Turnbows left and didn't come back to testify in court against them. So they just left. But Girard was in on that business. And then probably one of the more famous incidents involving Girard Cochran is in 1876. And this is sort of a long history. I'll try to shorthand it as much as I can. 1876, Alexander Findley and Wells McNall went hunting some horses. They assumed that the horses who were Findley's had been stolen by the Nez Perce. And so as they went out searching, they ran across an Indian camp out Whiskey Creek Way, and they saw it was a camp. There were some deer hanging in the trees, and they decided to wait. When the Indians came back in, they accused them, or there was a confrontation, and Findley and Wells McNall insisted that they come back into the lower valley to meet with the rest of the settlers so that they could settle the situation. In that confrontation, A.B. Findley or Wells McNall started wrestling over a gun or a rope, depending on who you listen to. and with one of the Indians, Willat and yelled at Findlay to shoot the Nez Perce man, which he did and killed him. So that happened in June. So you can imagine it was pretty dicey and tense times in the Wallowa Valley over that killing of Willat, who was a respected Nez Perce man. And as it turned out, the horses showed up behind Findlay's place a few days later. In any case, Joseph and the Wallowa band were highly upset over that. So when they came back into the valley, they demanded a conference with the settlers. They did have a council over that. The Nez Perce were insistent that Wells McNall and Findlay be turned over to them for their court of justice, not the white court of justice. The whites refused. They sent out envoys to go to wall to wall to bring in the military to help quiet the situation. While that was going on, they sent Gerard Cochran and W.W. White, Wesley White, up the valley to let the folks know who were settled at Alder to warn them. As White and Cochran were going up the valley, they were intercepted by a Umatilla Indian and who was acting as a scout for Joseph's band, who were up at Wallowa Lake. Cochran told the Umatilla man that Joseph better watch himself. That the Grand Rounders, they were going to send for the Grand Rounders, and they would come over and whip them all and take care of them. And he further said that, I'll scalp Joseph myself and put his scalp on my bridle. So Cochran would have been about 22, 23 years old during that time period. So as they made their way up to Alder, the scout relayed the information to Joseph. As Cochran and White made their way to the Alder settlement, the Nez Perce swooped down from Wallowa Lake. Cochran ducked into the barn, and W.W. White hid under a bed. Of course, the folks at Alder were not too pleased by this development. And so Joseph demanded through a couple interpreters to know what was going on, whether it was true what Cochran was saying. The settlers drug Cochran and White out. Joseph stood over Cochran, demanding through an interpreter, through Davis, an explanation. The upshot of that was that Cochran's father, who was present, agreed to quiet the situation down by taking his son out of the Grand Round Valley and not to return. That's what they agreed on. And then the following day or so, the military arrived and they averted that situation. And then the next notice we have of Cochran is we know that his father, J.H. Cochran, who was in the Cove, lived in Cove, that he had actually set up a tent right just by Wade Point, roughly where the passing lanes are there. And the editor from the La Grande Gazette was taking a tour of the Wallowa Valley in '79 and stopped in and ate dinner at the Cochran household. There's not a specific mention of Cochran, but it's almost certain that he was with his family at that time. And then he, just for comparison, there is the homestead claim that Cochran settled on. And if you remember, that's just a stone's throw away from Sam Wade's place. Basically, yeah, as you get, pardon? At the S-curve. That is, yeah, just basically as you hit the passing lanes. And kind of rounding it out with, or adding a little more insult to injury with Gerard Cochran. In 1881, some of you have probably heard of this, the murder of John Hawk, which happened in Lost Teen. It's unknown who did it, but it was a group of vigilantes. John Hawk was on his way to LeGrand. He had been accused of cattle rustling. And when he was camped there, just in the river bottom below Lost Teen, above the bridge, they shot into the tent and killed him. And a little bit from the Willamette farmer there from November 18th, 1881. That happened on the 3rd of November. But of the men that were indicted for that crime and stood trial in LeGrand was Gerard Cochran, Aaron Wade, Bill Duncan, and Richard Surjette. So 4 men, none of them were convicted of the crime, and actually the court records have disappeared. This is another kind of deep rabbit hole to go down, but the book written by some of you probably know knew John and his wife, who wrote this book. It's a great little book. Since their writing, more has been found out about the case, but no one was ever convicted of the crime, and it's really ultimately not been solved. But it's interesting that Cochran was one of the men indicted. And then finally, rounding out his life, Gerard Cochran was shot by James Keeler in Lost Teen about midnight on October 1st, returning from a dance with Mrs. Jam Keeler. In other words, he had been seeing Mrs. Keeler, who had left her husband for some time, and James Keeler came up and shot Cochran in the neck, and he died the following day. And he's buried in that little tiny West Side cemetery that Marilyn mentioned, where the Findlay children are buried as well, in an unmarked grave.
What year was that?
87. Yep. And then rounded out to the other person mentioned in there, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because this is a long, involved history. It is Michael Pefferly. And that's just early shot of Baker City there. And then one of Dr. M. Pefferly dentist ads from the Baker City Morning Democrat in 1892. And again, I'm shorthanding this terribly, but Pefferly left the state of Baden, Germany in 1848. And he was known as part of the immigration, German immigrants who were called the 48ers. They left at that time because basically, most of Europe was in chaos at that time. There were revolutions going on everywhere. The monarchical system, the system of kings, and that of dukes and duchesses and etc., and the onset of transitioning into capitalism from feudalism and these sort of things. There was widespread demand for democracy, or at least parliamentary government, and changes. And so these revolutions were sweeping across Europe in that year, 1848. And Michael Pefferly was almost certainly involved in that. It's clear that he was an educated person. He was a talented musician. He could write well. And that he left Germany in that year, 1848, caught a boat in France and made his way over to New York City, and was there for a few years. He joined the U.S. military, and with them went around down through the way and crossed on the Panama Canal and landed up in Washington Territory during the Yakima War. So he was in the infantry fighting in the Yakima War, and that's how he came to the West Coast and out into the Pacific Northwest. And we see that after what he did is when he left the military, he was up at the when they were surveying the boundary between Canada and Washington State. He was up there and he got discharged. And what he did is the first thing he did is he went back to New York City. He got his first wife, and they came back, and they came to Walla Walla, and he opened a provision store with a bakery and sold booze. And then shortly thereafter, he opened up a music hall, basically a saloon in Walla Walla in '62. And he divorced his first wife, and he married. He got married in Walla Walla. There, you can see on November 3rd, 1863, in Walla Walla. And you'll probably recognize the name. He married Melinda McAlexander, who was the sister of A.V. McAlexander. Melinda had came to Walla Walla from, she was an educated person. She went to the University of Oregon. She came to Walla Walla to become a school teacher. Prior to public school, she was a subscription school teacher. So her and another lady opened one of the first subscription schools in Walla Walla. And Walla Walla was a very rough place at the time. Like, it wasn't uncommon to, it's the actual old Westy stuff, fairly frequent duels on Main Street, like once a week. So this German immigrant, Pfefferly, marries Melinda McAlexander, an educated school teacher. Click. And so after they got married, they left Walla Walla, and as these gold strikes were happening all over, the original gold strike in Idaho, 1860, they quickly, 1861, discovered gold in northeast Oregon, Baker City, south side of the Wallowa Mountains, and they quickly discovered additional strikes on the Salmon River, in the Boise Basin, in Waihe. So there were prospectors swarming in everywhere, and a lot of these mining centers and towns sprang up. One of these was Bannock City, which now, today, is called Idaho City, but that's Melinda McAlexander and Pfefferly sold their store and saloon in Walla Walla and went to Bannock City and set up a bakery there. From there, they ended up in Boise City, and then from there to Caldwell, and then from there to Baker. I'm shorthanding this because there's lots more ins and outs in between there, and they travel on beyond Baker City. But in the interest of time, so we see a couple of his Pfefferly's ads. The one on the far right, when they left Bannock City, and they came to Boise City, he opened a bathing and barber shop. And you can see he's got hot and cold shower, sulfur, medicated, steam baths, come on in. And then there's a later one there from '68, slightly later. One of the things there that I think is interesting to notice is that he's in this Pioneer Shaving Saloon, and he offers shaving, hair cutting, shampooing, and teeth extraction, cupping, and bleeding. So, and of course, baths, medicated, sulfur, etc. So the line between dentist and doctor was pretty narrow back in the day. You could get it all. You need to get bled, show up, get a tooth pulled, get your hair fixed, take a bath. And then later, by 1881, we see one of his earliest, him as making the transition to a dentist, from saloon, music hall guy, to barber, bathing salon, and then on to dentist by '81 in Boise City. So again, going back to this original statement, Sam Wade said he'd often seen a good horse lying beside the grave but not skinned, and the Indians told him it was for the chief to have a fresh horse in the happy hunting ground. Wade also said that Gerard Cochran told him he and L. Pfefferly robbed the grave in about 79 or 80, a very bright moonlit night, did it in a hurry, not to tell anyone. If they found out, they'd kill him. McAlexander said he didn't know anything about it. So trying to, and this is a little inside baseball. I'll go through this fairly quickly, but for me, I'm trying to verify, is there anything that we can say yay or nay to support what Horner says? I don't have any reason to doubt Sam Wade, what he said. But can we historically verify those statements and give it a little more certainty than we have? When we look at Michael Pfefferle's timeline in 1879, when it's claimed that he did it, we see that he's running ads for piano tuning and instrument repair and ads for his barbershop in January. February, same thing. In March, we have lots of notices that he's renovating and adding a second story, raising his barbershop. And in April, we see that Mrs. Verlinda McAlexander, the mother of his wife, shows up in Boise City. She comes because his wife is sick. So she comes and she spends 3 weeks. So she's there, and she shows up in early April. At that same time, Pfefferle organizes the Boise City Brass Band, and he completes his renovations. In May, the band is organized, and they're practicing at Pfefferle's place. He's the leader. In June, Mrs. McAlexander returns home at the end of June. In July, Pfefferle and the brass band play in the 4th of July parade, and he forms a partnership with this character because he added a second story to his barber salon. He partners with this character, A.W. Spooner, who's a dentist. Spooner moves into the upstairs, and by September, we see Spooner's ads appearing in the tri-weekly Idaho Statesman. In October, Spooner places a little note that he's sick and able to attend to his dentistry practice, but his ads continue. In November, Spooner says he's back to work. We see that the band plays at various events. And in December, Pfefferle dissolves the partnership with Spooner and replaces his name for Spooner in the ad. So, in 79, would he have been in the Wallowa Valley? 80, this is the other year it was claimed that it happened. January, he's playing in the New Year's Day concert. He swaps out dentist partners. C.W. Newsom suddenly shows up as advertising above his barbershop. In February, he also had a string band besides the brass band. They played at a masquerade ball. He was also a pallbearer at a funeral. In March, he played again with a string band at a dance at the Overland Hotel. In April, Newsom's ads above his barbershop continue. They play, a string band plays at a calico ball. The members of the band aren't specifically mentioned, but Pfefferle was almost certainly part of that. In May, Pfefferle replaces Newsom's name with his own as dentist, and we see him at a fire department meeting. In June, he shows up in the 1880 census. Typically, that's not great proof, but he shows up in it. He could have been gone, but so it's hard to say. In July, his son Loring was born, and then August, there's a new ad for dentistry for his dentistry and barbershop. And one of the things that the paper, in his ad, it notes that his success, both as a barber and a dentist, is due to the fact that he is always at his post. September, he runs another new ad, and then in October, he rents his downstar. He stops being a barber and rents that to Young and Smith, and his dentist ads continue. And again, in November, his string band plays a Thanksgiving ball, and through December, his ads continue. So we can track Pfefferle fairly well through 79 and 80, and it's up to debate whether he was digging up the grave in 79 and 80. As far as Cochran goes, in 79, January, who knows? February, who knows? March, we know that his family, his uncle, had moved their sawmill from the Cove up to Hurricane Creek, and by March they had it up and running. The other thing is just looking at the homestead files. We know when Cochran proved up on his homestead. Typically that was a 5-year swing. You can't with 100% guarantee that he filed and then 5 years later he proved up. because sometimes they would squat there for a time period before. But it's fairly likely, based on the other evidence, that Girard homesteaded in 79, in the spring of 79. April, don't know what he was doing. May, we know that the Cochran family was living at Long Ford, near what was known as Long Ford, because that's where you crossed the river prior. There was no bridge there at that point. And in that same month, Girard's younger brother, James, died of diphtheria and is buried up here in the Older Slope Cemetery. In June, we know that his sister, Allie, or Alphonson, was up at the 4th of July celebration at Wallowa Lake. July, no sign of him. August, no sign. September, no sign. October, no sign. And in November, based on an account in Horner, we know that Girard went with quite a few other cattlemen and went down to Joseph Creek to gather cattle. And then December, we don't know. And then as far as 1880, January, don't know. We do know that his father, James Cochran, had delinquent stock in the Blue Mountain and Columbia River Railroad, and that was sold. Nothing about Girard, however. March, no word. April, no word. May, no word. By June, we can see that the Cochran family, including Girard, was included within the Silver Lake precinct. But I think, Marianne, I'll probably get this wrong. There was only 2 precincts in all of Wallowa County in that 1880 census. And one of them was Silver Lake, and the other one, I think, was Wallowa. So Silver Lake precinct was a big precinct, but it would included likely Lost Teen, where the Cochrans were. And Girard was definitely in Wallowa Valley in June of 1880, and he was dealing livestock according to the census at that time. July, August, who knows? September of 80, Girard Cochran is one of 10 cattlemen who signed a letter that was published in the Mountain Sentinel accusing John Hawk of lying about W.W. White. W.W. White was running for sheriff at that time. Hawk published a notice saying some disparaging things about White. These 10 men, including Cochran, signed their names to a letter supporting White for sheriff. So we know he was there. October, don't know. And then again, Cochran, we have another little bit about Cochran in herding cattle down in Joseph Creek at that time. Nothing in December. So we don't have a very good handle on exactly where Cochran was at and what he was doing, except that we can say he was here. He had been exiled, and he had came back in 79. And then a couple of other things to think about in terms of the truth of the statement is that you can see where Sam Wade's homestead, you can see where Girard Cochran's homestead was, and you can see where his sister Alphonson's Cochran's homestead was. So the Wades and the Cochrans, at least in terms of proximity, were closely connected. The other thing is that Alphonson married Sam Wade's wife's brother. So Alphonson, Girard's sister, was married into the Wade family for a short time period. So they had connections. So it seems likely that what Sam Wade heard from Girard Cochran probably has some basis in fact, and is probably likely somewhat true.
They were running cattle out in that Swamp Creek area too at the same time. The Cochran was in Joseph Creek, so it was the same cattle.
Yeah.
Using the same stock driveways and all that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. They tag teamed it, all that sort of stuff. Yep. Yes, yes. That's the 86, that's the 1886 grave robbery, yeah. That's where they stole the skull. Yeah, yeah. In terms of motivation, or, you know, if we're thinking about, okay, well, it looks to me that Pefferly probably was not there. Probably not. Doesn't, not, well, the first grave robbery, 79, 80, what they did is they went in and they took the grave goods. the grave goods disappeared. So in 86, when they went back to get the skull, the grave had already been looted. That makes sense. So two episodes. The first episode here is whether Pefferly was involved in it. My basic take is no, probably not. He probably wasn't. Cochrane, I would say probably likely that he was involved. He was there. And I would say, based on this, one of the things here just on the bottom there, or reading it, and Cochrane told the Indian if Joseph didn't behave himself, he would bring a bunch of men over from Grand Round and kill the Indians all off, and he would kill Joseph and scalp him and wear his scalp off his bridle. And Joseph got these words in a very short time, and while at Wright's place up on Alder Slope, they got Cochrane out of the barn. Joseph told him what he had said, and Cochrane denied it, saying he never said any such thing. And the Indian he said it to was standing by Cochrane and told him he was a liar and slapped him in the face quite hard. So this is what happened to this proud young man who was known as a braggart, who liked to boast, according to Horner, about his conquests, who got slapped in the face in front of all the settlers, and the settlers were not happy with him because he had acted foolishly and almost caused a big incident, and he gets slapped in the face. His father has to take him back, in agreement with Joseph, to stop a fight, take him out of the valley. And so if I had to say a motivation for revenge, possibly that's it.
You still haven't said where the connection is, that the skull ended up in Dennis.
Yeah, well,
I don't quite get the connection.
yep, well, quickly, Pefferly, who married Melinda McAlexander, that was the sister of A.V. McAlexander. And so when they came in 86 on a visit, Pefferly went up there with A.V. McAlexander, Melinda McAlexander, his Andrew McAlexander, and they dug up the grave then for the second time and took the skull. Yes. Yep.
David, what would have been on the grave?
What-
What kind of artifacts might have been in the grave that would have been looted in the one incident
Yeah.
you're talking about?
Since it was Joseph's grave, we have lots of accounts. It was well known in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, that lots of valuable items were placed in graves, native graves, including gold coins. So it was no secret. So very valuable personal items that would be put in the grave. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's not the only grave that was looted down that way, where there's better accounts of what was in them. But a whole variety of personal things would go in the grave, right? So, and then again, as far as motives, I think Cochrane had a motive really that he was a brash, proud, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? What was that? Huh? Yeah, he was a kind of a scoundrel for sure. So his motivation may have lain on that side, and it may have just been a little bit of revenge. As far as Pefferly, to your point, Millie, no, Pefferly was an amateur scientist, I would say, an amateur naturalist. He was considered himself very educated. When we think about this in the country, Samuel Morton's Crania Americana, which was published in 1839, which basically is this lavish book where they are studying, Samuel Morton, native skulls, basically to prove that white people are smarter than native folk, right? So by measuring skulls, they could say that the order of events is you got black folk down here and white folk up here, and then the Indians fall somewhere in the middle based on skull size. Reviewing the data and the science doesn't work out. It doesn't work out well. There's just no basis for it. But at the time, this was widely known and widely talked about and was considered the leading scientific idea running around. So skulls were stolen everywhere. We'll get into that a little bit more. I would just point out to this question of what Pefferelli's potential motivation was. So this little account from the Idaho City Semi-Weekly World in '85, just before he robs the grave for the second time and takes the skull, it says, Judge Heath showed us a specimen the other day which was taken from his mine in the shape of a hummingbird. This is quite a curiosity. Evidently, the little fellow had flown into the tunnel and being unable to find its way out again, fell and perished there. The flesh, which at one time clung to its little bones, had dried and withered away to nothing, leaving the form of the bird and the color of the feathers in a perfect state of preservation. And altogether, the aspect was one of extreme wonder. The judge intends sending it to Dr. Pefferly of Boise, which will add materially to the already handsome variety of the bird species the doctor has so diligently labored to secure. So here we know that Pefferly was collecting bird specimens, doing the taxidermy, and displaying them in his shops, right? So we get sort of that this educated German came over who had this interest in natural science, and at that time, Indians were natural science, right? And just to add a little bit of complexity to the situation, Melinda McAlexander, who was also educated, she was educated at the U of O when it was first opened. Her dad built the building, and herself was a teacher. She wrote this letter to the Bluegrass Blade in Kentucky, and the Bluegrass Blade was an atheist newspaper. And Melinda explained why I'm an atheist. It will take only a few lines to express my opinions. I'm an atheist because in reading the Bible, I use my reason and best judgment, turning on the searchlight of science as best I could. The rock on which atheism builds is science. It needs no creed to preserve it, asks no law to protect it. My opinions are that what the priests and clergymen have been telling us are false and are not to be relied upon, and that the only thing that we can depend upon is science, and that when the world learns this lesson, humanity will be wiser and happier. History teaches me that instead of religion being truth's ablest champion, it's oftener its stumbling block. The Bible is at the bottom of all the trouble in the world today. So we get a picture of who they were as a couple and sort of what their thinking was. They were out of step, I would say, with a lot of folks of their time that, with these sort of viewpoints. Yeah. And so just an example of this notion of, and there are so many accounts of this, we could wade into it for a long time. But this is one that kind of catches my eye. It's from the San Francisco Chronicle of 1896. And this guy, Howard Kloss, was living in Portland. And it's a kind of a long article on his house in Portland and how full of skulls and native bones it is. And the little quote over there is part of the article. Of all the strange ways of making a living, Howard Kloss of Portland, Oregon, has chosen the most uncanny, collecting the skulls of the dead. The skulls he gathers are those of Indians. And so a Indian skull, depending on the time period, could be worth anywhere from $5 to $25. If you had a skull of a known Native American Indian, could go for much more than that. So in the case of Chief Joseph, old Joseph, who was a known native, famous native, skull would be much more valuable. For instance, Kamayakan skull, the great Yakima leader, stolen. Several of the skulls of the Modoc who were hung and after the Modoc Wars, heads removed and ended up in the Army Military Hospital collections, and there are others. Kumkali, the famous Chinook leader, his skull was stolen. And so this business of gathering native skulls, a lot of these would go to collections because a lot of people were collecting those, and they would also go to these scientific organizations where they were measuring Indian skulls to prove theories about racial superiority for that. And then locally, there was just lots of artifact collecting going on. Lee Morehouse, who was one of the Indian agents over at Umatilla, amassed a huge collection of Indian artifacts, including clothing and weapons and baskets and artifacts beyond belief. A lot of you have probably seen his photographs. He took tons of photographs, and he actually became fairly well-to-do by reprinting and selling his photographs. But that's from the Umatilla County Fair in 1897. And then this final little bit, there's lots of these. Here's an example. An old gentleman is engaged in exhuming the dead bodies of Indians buried along the Naha River. He's probably hunting for relics in the shape of arrowheads, elk teeth, etc. If there's no law against disturbing the resting place of the red race, there should be. Wallowa News, that's from 1902. And then just concluding here, that's just a shot of John Horner and Francis McFarland and Rachel Monteith. You'll notice at the bottom there the place where old Joseph's bones will be placed at the foot of the monument. This is the evening before the ceremonies that happened on September 26, 1926, prior to moving his bones and placing them in Wallowa Lake. So I would finish it there, knowing we've run on a bit long. Apologize for that, but yeah, it was Wildegroot. I'm forgetting his first name, but they paid him to make that monument. Wildegroot. Does anyone know that name? Yeah, he was a stonemason. Yeah, but that's it. Yeah. Yes, Lisa.
So is the skull back with
Oh
the
boy.
body, or is it missing stuff?
Oh boy. No, that's a great question.
Missing?
It is.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I should have, that's an obvious, yeah. Yeah. And I was saying in the long history that missing, it's not as if the Nez Perce and Umatilla have given up trying to find it. They have. And they've recently repatriated some beads from the grave from somebody or another who had gathered beads from the grave. So, yeah, there's definitely still looking. Yeah.
Has there been any archaeological, like a professional survey done in that site?
No.
Seems like that should happen.
Yes, it does. It definitely does. Because you could, with ground penetrating radar, what would be important is you could say, yes, there's 12 graves here, 8 graves here. This is where they're at. You could certainly tell with radar what was there. Yeah. Yeah.
What about the big collections, both militarily and privately, of the skulls?
Yeah, with NAGPRA, the Native Repatriation Act, a lot around those things. A lot of the tribal groups have been getting their ancestors back and doing whatever they do. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, but it's been a big, it's been a contentious thing over the years. But yeah.
Well done, David.
Yep. Thank you.